get to Canada and its threat to cut off energy exports to the U.S. in retaliation for the Trump tariffs. First one up here is 35, because there are more than 35 major electricity lines on the U.S.-Canadian border. And you think about it, you have 70 oil and gas pipelines. Most of the power, though, goes in one direction.
More than 35 major electricity lines on the U.S.-Canadian border. You have 70 oil and gas pipelines. Most of the power, though, goes in one direction. That was a grid infrastructure analyst speaking on CBC News in early January 2026, days before Canada quietly adjusted hydroelectric export pricing to the United States. No dramatic press conference, no tariff announcement, just technical modifications inside wholesale power contracts that immediately began flowing through to American utility bills. 35 high-voltage transmission lines, 70 energy pipelines, billions of kilowatt hours moving south every single day, all suddenly more expensive. Base load electricity, the kind that runs 24/7 regardless of weather, wind, or sun. The kind American states in the Northeast, Great Lakes, and Upper Midwest have built their entire grid planning around for decades. The kind that cannot be replaced overnight because infrastructure takes years to build and physics doesn't negotiate. While Trump escalated tariff threats, expecting Canadian submission, Ottawa demonstrated a different kind of leverage entirely. While Trump assumed economic coercion would force compliance, Canada showed that controlling the switch matters more than controlling customs. While Trump weaponized trade policy, Canada monetized dependency. The miscalculation is catastrophic. Trump's tariffs didn't punish Canada. They triggered the one countermeasure Washington cannot quickly escape. January 2026, no specific date announced, no government decree issued. Canadian provincial utilities, Hydro-Quebec, Manitoba Hydro, BC Hydro, Ontario Power Generation, adjusted wholesale export pricing for electricity sold into American markets. Increases ranged from modest per megawatt hour bumps to significantly higher peak demand pricing during winter cold snaps and summer heat waves. The mechanism was entirely legal, contractual, market-based, justified by infrastructure investment needs, reservoir management costs, climate adaptation expenses, and long-term grid modernization. No politician needed to approve it, no legislative vote required. Provincial crown corporations managing hydroelectric assets simply exercised pricing authority they'd always possessed, but rarely used aggressively. American utilities absorbed the cost first. Regional grid operators in New England, New York, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota registered higher wholesale import prices immediately. Those costs don't stay at wholesale level. They transmit automatically downstream. Utilities recalculate cost recovery, state regulators approve rate adjustments, retail electricity prices rise. Weeks later, American households open bills showing 8 to 12% increases depending on region. Manufacturing plants see energy costs jump 10 to 15% quarter over quarter. Data centers burning hundreds of megawatts per facility confront millions in unexpected operating expense growth. No one explicitly connects higher bills to Trump's tariff war. Utilities cite market conditions, regulators approve cost recovery adjustments. Media reports seasonal price volatility. But the underlying reality is unmistakable. Canada raised prices because Trump politicized energy, and American consumers are paying the bill. The numbers expose the dependency. United States imports approximately 10% of total electricity consumption from Canada. That percentage sounds modest until examining regional concentration. New England imports over 20% from Hydro-Quebec. New York State pulls 15% from Canadian sources. Upper Midwest states, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, rely on Manitoba Hydro and Ontario Power Generation for 12 to 18% of supply. Those aren't luxury imports. They're baseload necessity. American utilities didn't choose Canadian hydro because it was cheap. They chose it because it was reliable. Hydroelectric dams produce continuous power, no fuel costs, no emissions concerns, no weather dependency beyond long-term reservoir management, perfect for stabilizing grids facing unpredictable demand. That reliability allowed decades of delayed domestic investment. Why build expensive new plants when Quebec can ship steady power across existing transmission lines? Why modernize aging infrastructure when Manitoba Hydro fills gaps? Why accelerate renewable deployment when BC provides clean baseload? American grid planning became structurally dependent on Canadian imports. Transmission corridors sized around cross-border flows. Regional capacity calculations assumed external supply. Long-term contracts locked utilities into multi-year import commitments. By 2026, that dependency was physical reality. You cannot rewire a regional grid in months, cannot build replacement generation capacity in a single year, cannot substitute intermittent renewables for continuous baseload without massive battery storage not yet deployed at scale. Trump's tariff threats assumed flexibility that doesn't exist in electricity markets. Steel can be resourced, lumber can be rerouted, consumer goods can shift suppliers. But power plants, transmission lines, and grid operations move on decade-long timelines, not political cycles. That's the trap Canada exploited. Once infrastructure dependency is established, pricing power follows, and Trump handed Ottawa the justification to use it. For decades, Canadian provinces priced electricity exports conservatively. Goal was market share, not maximum revenue. Keep American utilities happy, maintain steady demand, avoid politicizing energy relationship. Trump's tariff war destroyed that equilibrium, threatening 25% duties on Canadian steel, aluminum, lumber, suggesting tariffs on oil and gas, treating cross-border energy flows as bargaining chips rather than shared continental assets. Ottawa's response was strategic recalibration. If Washington treats energy as political weapon, Canada prices it as strategic asset, not retaliation. Market reality. Hydroelectric power has value. Infrastructure has costs. Investment requires returns, all perfectly rational economic justifications, but timing and execution reveal strategic intent. Price increases concentrated during peak demand periods when American grids are most stressed. Winter heating season in Northeast, summer cooling loads across Midwest, exactly when alternatives are scarcest and replacement power costs highest. Canadian utilities also adjusted capacity payments, fees American grid operators pay for guaranteed supply during emergencies. Those payments ensure power will be available when needed most. Raising capacity fees doesn't show up as tariff, but functions identically. Higher costs for American buyers, more revenue for Canadian suppliers. Third lever is interruptibility clauses. Some contracts allow Canadian utilities to reduce exports during domestic emergencies or extreme weather, historically rarely invoked, but subtle changes in contract language or interpretation can create uncertainty. American grid operators must plan for potential supply disruptions. That forces costly backup arrangements or acceptance of higher prices for guaranteed availability. None of these mechanisms require legislation. No parliamentary vote, no cabinet approval, provincial utilities exercising contractual rights and market pricing authority they've always possessed. Effect on United States is immediate and compounding. Wholesale electricity costs rise first. Grid operators revise forecasts. Utilities submit rate increase requests to state regulators. Approval processes take weeks or months, then retail prices adjust. For American households, especially older Americans on fixed incomes, impact is direct and unavoidable. Electricity is not discretionary spending, cannot be postponed, cannot be reduced below minimum thresholds without compromising heating, cooling, food storage, medical equipment. When bills rise 10, 15%, that money comes from somewhere else. Groceries, healthcare, transportation, savings. Retirees allocating larger share of fixed income to utilities suddenly face impossible choices. Trade war logic says higher prices punish foreign suppliers. Energy reality says higher prices punish domestic consumers. Manufacturing absorbs double hit. Tariffs already increased costs for imported materials and components. Now energy expenses, and often 15 to 25% of operating costs for heavy industry, jump simultaneously. Margins compress. Some firms pass costs downstream. Others delay investment, reduce production, cut overtime, freeze hiring. Regional concentration makes pain worse. Northeastern and Great Lakes states heavily dependent on Canadian electricity also host energy-intensive industries, steel, chemicals, automotive, paper, aluminum. Those sectors already struggling with tariff-induced cost pressures now confront electricity price increases that cannot be avoided or substituted quickly. Data centers face existential pressure. Hyperscale facilities consume hundreds of megawatts continuously. Even modest per kilowatt hour increases multiply into millions annually. Those costs flow into cloud service pricing, AI training expenses, digital infrastructure costs across entire economy. technology sector concentrated in regions most dependent on Canadian hydro, upstate New York, Massachusetts. Increasingly, Great Lakes states attracting data center investment due to cooler climates and proximity to renewable power sources, specifically Canadian hydro. When electricity costs rise 12-15%, operating models break. Subscription prices increase, enterprise contracts renegotiate, infrastructure expansion plans delay, all because Trump's tariff war triggered Canadian pricing response that American tech sector cannot escape. Grid operators face operational nightmare. Higher import costs during peak demand force difficult choices. Run more expensive domestic generation, often natural gas plants with fuel costs plus emissions concerns. Implement demand response programs asking large users to reduce consumption. Risk supply shortfalls if forecasts prove optimistic. Every option carries costs. More expensive generation raises overall system prices. Demand response programs pay industrial users to curtail, adding expense. Supply shortfalls risk brownouts or rolling blackouts with catastrophic economic and political consequences. Washington confronts reality it cannot quickly fix. Building new baseload generation capacity takes 5 to 10 years minimum. Nuclear plants require decade-plus timelines. Natural gas plants need pipeline infrastructure, environmental approvals, financing, construction. Even accelerated permitting cannot overcome physical construction constraints. Renewable energy expanding rapidly but cannot replace continuous baseload without massive battery storage. Grid-scale storage technology exists, but deployment lags far behind need. Building storage capacity to replace Canadian hydro imports would cost hundreds of billions and require years. Transmission infrastructure equally constrained. Rerouting power flows requires new high-voltage lines. Siting and permitting processes take years. Construction adds more time. Cannot rewire regional grids to eliminate Canadian import dependency within single presidential term. Trump's trade war assumed American flexibility and Canadian vulnerability. Reality is opposite. United States locked into infrastructure dependency that cannot be quickly escaped. Canada controls resource America needs and just demonstrated willingness to price it strategically. Numbers quantify the leverage shift. American consumers and businesses now paying estimated $2 to $4 billion additional annually for Canadian electricity imports. That's conservative estimate based on 10% average price increase across 100 billion kilowatt hours annual imports. Higher peak pricing during winter and summer stress periods could push total impact to $5 to $7 billion annually. Capacity fee increases add another billion. Uncertainty costs from potential supply interruptions harder to quantify, but force utilities into expensive backup arrangements. Compared to Canada's position, Hydro-Quebec reported 61% jump in third quarter net income in 2025, partially due to strategic market timing, importing cheap electricity when surplus, exporting at premium when scarce. Price adjustments to American exports amplify that profitability. Manitoba Hydro, BC Hydro, Ontario Power Generation see similar dynamics. Higher export revenues flow to provincial treasuries, support infrastructure investment, validate decades of hydroelectric development, strengthen political support for continued renewable energy expansion. Ottawa gains strategic leverage without federal action. Provincial utilities making market-based pricing decisions. No tariff to challenge at WTO, no sanction to contest diplomatically, just electricity providers charging what markets will bear and contracts allow. For Trump, this is backfire scenario he never anticipated. Tariff threats intended to punish Canada and force trade concessions. Instead, triggered Canadian response that punishes American consumers, strengthens Canadian finances, and exposes American vulnerability Trump cannot quickly address. Worse, Canada's move is defensible and repeatable. Every time Trump escalates tariffs, Canadian provinces can adjust energy pricing, frame it as market response to investment needs or risk premiums. American consumers absorb cost. Trump's political position weakens as bills rise and industries suffer. Other countries watching closely. Norway examining natural gas leverage into Europe. Qatar positioning LNG exports as strategic tools. Australia and Chile controlling critical mineral supplies for batteries and electronics. Pattern emerging. Essential inputs matter more than finished products in modern trade conflicts. This dynamic exposes fundamental vulnerability in American strategy. Decades of assuming continental energy would remain apolitical. Canadian hydro and oil flowing south as mutual interest rather than strategic asset. That assumption enabled infrastructure dependency Trump inherited but never understood. Once energy becomes politicized through tariff threats, pipeline disputes, or territorial rhetoric, suppliers recalibrate. Canada no longer prices electricity to maximize volume, prices to maximize leverage and returns. Transformation is permanent. Even if Trump reverses tariff threats, Canadian pricing won't necessarily return to previous levels. Infrastructure investment needs are real. Climate adaptation costs are genuine. Long-term contracts will reflect new pricing floors established during this period. The American utilities locked into multi-year import commitments cannot quickly diversify. Even utilities seeking alternatives face years-long timelines for new generation or transmission capacity. During that transition, Canadian leverage persists. Infrastructure creates permanence. Transmission lines built in 1970s, 1990s still carry power today. Hydroelectric dams operate for 100 years. Contracts signed in 2026 shape energy costs through 2030s. Investment decisions made now determine grid architecture for generation. Once Canadian provinces establish pricing power and American utilities adapt to higher costs, new baseline emerges. Future negotiations start from elevated levels. Canadian leverage becomes structural feature of continental energy relationship. Trump cannot tariff his way out of this. Imposing duties on Canadian electricity would raise American costs further without reducing dependency. Threatening other sectors, lumber, steel, aluminum, just gives Canadian provinces more justification for energy price increases. Cannot militarily intervene, cannot legislate lower prices, cannot executive order new power plants into existence. Physics and infrastructure timelines constrain presidential authority more effectively than any court or Congress. Trump has zero leverage. Every escalation worsens American position. Every threat strengthens Canadian resolve. Every tariff justifies higher energy prices that American consumers cannot avoid. From Canadian perspective, this is strategic validation. Energy security is economic security. Infrastructure investment creates long-term leverage. Pricing power flows from physical control of essential resources. From American perspective, this is strategic failure. Decades of infrastructure underinvestment created vulnerability. Tariff war exposed that weakness. Canadian response exploited it. Recovery requires years of construction and hundreds of billions in investment. Trump's tariffs pushed Canada to raise energy prices. U.S. bills explode. And the trade war just proved electricity matters more than customs. What do you think? Is Canada's energy pricing strategy a temporary response or a permanent shift in continental power dynamics that outlasts any presidency? Subscribe for analysis on trade wars, energy leverage, infrastructure dependency, and how essential resources reshape global power.